In this video, we're going to be continuing our DP-700 exam preparation course, and specifically, we're going to be looking at CI/CD and Lifecycle Management in Microsoft Fabric. So we're going to be going through version control, deployment pipelines, and database projects, specifically in the context of how to prepare for this DP-700 exam. We're not going to be going too deep on all of these topics. We could spend hours and hours talking about each of them, but I'm just going to be focusing on the information that is useful for you taking the exam. Okay, so starting off with version control. And version control in Fabric is set at the workspace level. So you can connect any of your workspaces up to a supported Git repository, which is Azure DevOps or GitHub currently. And there's a few things that you might need to know in terms of how to set it up for the first time. Now, some of those things are in the workspace settings, some of those things are in Azure DevOps, and some of those things are in the tenant level settings as well. So I've laid out a bit of a table here. So step one is going to be done by the Fabric tenant admin. So if that's not you, you'll have to get the Fabric tenant admin to do this. And there's a few settings in the admin portal, so the tenant settings for your Fabric tenant. Now, the most important one is users can synchronize workspace items with a Git repository. There's some others in there that we'll look at on the next slide, but that's the most important one. Everyone that sets up Git for the first time will need to enable this. And as I mentioned, that's in the Fabric admin portal. As well as that, you're also going to have to set up things on the Git repository side. Now, here I'm using the example of Azure DevOps. So you'll need an administrator in Azure DevOps, or that could be you if you haven't set up an organization before in Azure DevOps. They're going to need to set up the organization, the project, and the repo. We'll have a look at some of these things in a more hands-on way a little bit later on. Plus, you need to add your users to the Azure DevOps project or organization. And by users, I mean the same people that are in your workspace in Fabric, because you need permissions on both sides. And we'll look at the permissions in a bit more detail in a second. So then we get to the workspace level settings. So the Fabric admin can connect the workspace to the Git repository. And to do that, they're going to have to specify the organization, the project, the repo, and the branch. Again, we'll take a look at this in a second. And that's being done in the Fabric workspace settings. So here are some of the tenant level admin settings that are important or relevant to setting up Git. So let's go through some of these now. Okay, so a Fabric tenant admin can go into the admin portal and they can see these settings. And obviously here I've searched for Git, and there's four main ones related to Git integration that's worth understanding what they do. So the first one is the one that I mentioned, right? So users can synchronize workspace items with their Git repositories. The essential one that everyone needs if you're going to be using Git to version control your workspaces. This one is important because users can export to Git repositories in other geographical locations. So this is important if you set up Azure DevOps in another geographic location as compared to where your Fabric capacity is in Fabric. Now, if these are set up in different geographical locations, then you need to enable this so that you can commit changes to repos in other geographical locations. Now, the other important one is this one here. So users can sync workspace items with GitHub repositories. Okay, so if you are using GitHub in your organization, then you're definitely going to have to come in here and enable that as well. So that is the tenant level admin settings that you need to be aware of. Let's look at the workspace level settings now. So as a workspace admin, when you're in the process of connecting your workspace to a Git repository, on the left-hand side, this is what it's going to look like. If you're trying to connect to an Azure DevOps repo, you're going to be asked to submit the organization, the project, the repo, and the branch, and also a folder, which is optional. So you don't need to do that. But sometimes if you want to sync the contents of your workspace into a specific folder in Git, then you can do that. If you're implementing some sort of mono repo strategy, that's what you'll do in that instance. On the GitHub side, you need a display name, a personal access token, which you get from GitHub itself, and the repository URL, so the GitHub repository URL. Okay, so once you've got everything set up and you've connected your workspace to a Git repository, who can do what in your workspace regarding Git integration? Now, this might not be assessed on the DP-700, but I think it's very important. If you're going to implement this in your organization, it's quite useful to know who can do what, because you might face some stumbling blocks in this area. So let's start off with the admin. So the admin can connect to a Git repository. These are workspace level roles, so it's a workspace admin. So they can also remove and update existing connections. They can also switch the branch in the workspace for everyone. So the way that branching works in Fabric, at least in the UI, is that when you change the branch, it changes for absolutely everyone. It's not on a personal or on a session-by-session basis. You're changing the workspace branch. They can also check out a new branch. And again, that's going to change it for everyone. The contributor, member, and viewer, they can't do any of those things. Next, we go to some of the permissions that both the admin and member and contributors can do. Those three roles can commit changes to a Git repository, pull remote updates from a Git repository into your workspace, and they can also branch out to a new workspace. And we'll take a quick look at branching out and what that is in the context of Fabric a little bit later on. To do that, we're also assuming that the user has the ability to create new workspaces. And that's at the tenant level. That's another tenant level setting that your tenant administrator will have to do. You can set up groups of people within your organization that have this ability. And if your member or contributor is not in that group, you can also set it up for the whole organization as well, but that's not normally how that setting is implemented in most organizations. It's normally restricted to a group of people that have that ability to kind of avoid this big sprawl of workspaces. So as long as they are in that group, they have the ability to create new workspaces in Fabric, they can use this branching out to a new workspace feature. And the viewer in the workspace, well, they can view Fabric items in the workspace. That's literally the only thing they can do. They can't do anything related to Git, not even see the branch. They can't even see the Git status of items and things like that. So another really important thing to bear in mind, and this is probably worthwhile testing out yourself, is to think about what gets checked into version control. Because Fabric is a SaaS platform, you don't really have much control over what gets checked into version control. Right? If you're a software engineer and you're writing C#, pretty much exactly what you write coding-wise on the page gets checked into version control. Well, in Fabric, we're updating UIs, and then Microsoft is actually choosing what gets checked into version control. Every item is slightly different, okay? So I recommend you go into a Fabric workspace, you set it up to version control, and then you create lots of different items, and you check which parts of them are tracked through this version control system. Here's some general rules that we found just from testing this quite extensively. So as a general rule, this is fair enough. Like no data is ever committed into version control, which is what you want, right? You don't want sensitive data or any data really checked into version control. So the data itself, tabular data in lakehouses, data warehouses, semantic models, is as a rule not checked into version control. Similarly, file data is also not checked into version control. So data you put into a lakehouse file area, that's not going to get checked into version control. Stuff you put even in an environment resource folder, so files, you can actually add individual files into an environment resource folder. They will also not get checked into version control. Refresh schedules do not get checked into version control either. So if you've got a data pipeline in your test environment with a schedule or in your development environment, and you check that into version control, well, there's no actual representation of that schedule in version control, okay? We'll also get to deployment in a second, but what you'll find is that if it doesn't get checked into version control, it's not going to get deployed either, okay? So when you deploy it to production, that refresh schedule will be gone, and you'll have to either set it up manually, or you can use, there's an API endpoint that maybe I'll show you a little bit later on for, I think it's called create item schedule in the Fabric REST API. Then we get into some of the differences between data warehouses and lakehouses. So data warehouses, the structure of the data warehouse is checked into version control. So what you find is things like create table statements, create view statements for all of your objects in your data warehouse. A SQL project is also checked into version control, and we'll look at that in more detail a little bit later on for a data warehouse. For lakehouses, nothing really gets checked into version control. So that's something to bear in mind. So any tables that you're creating, any sort of logic that you're adding in there will not get checked into version control. And therefore, any updates that you make to a lakehouse will not get checked into version control. Now, there's a few ways around this. If you create a notebook with all of your create table statements, then that is one way around it. Also serves as a more useful asset when it comes to deploying a lakehouse as well, to do this kind of declarative method for setting up lakehouses in a notebook rather than doing them through a code and kind of progressively adding more and more tables organically. So it's more like a infrastructure as code style to creating a lakehouse, which becomes very useful when you go to deploy it as well. So it's important to note that in general, if something doesn't get checked into version control, it won't get deployed. Now, I'm not sure if that's an official rule, but that's just what I've experienced from testing these quite rigorously. Pretty much everything, if you don't see it in your Git repository in version control, it also will not get deployed, that particular thing. So like the refresh schedule is an example of that. The lakehouse, obviously when you check in a lakehouse, you don't get any tables or anything like that. And it's the same when you deploy it. So no tables will get created for you. All right, so I've just switched over to Fabric. Now let's talk through some of the version control features and actually implement them, just so you can see what it looks like in Fabric. The first thing that we mentioned in the slides was the admin portal. So before you do anything in Fabric, in your workspace settings, either you need to go in here yourself into this admin portal, or you need to get the tenant admin of your tenant to do it. So I am the tenant admin of this tenant, so I can go in here myself and I can search for the specific properties or the specific settings that are appropriate for Git integration. So this is where you need to go. This is the most important one to make sure that users can synchronize workspace items with their Git repositories. So that needs to be enabled. These are the other settings around multi-geo. So if you've got your Azure DevOps organization in a different geography to your Fabric capacity, you need to enable this. And if you want to use GitHub, you need to use this here. The other one that we mentioned when we were walking through some of the slides is this one, the Create Workspaces feature. So I've got it enabled for the entire organization, but what would normally be the case is to enable it for specific security groups. Now, this is what trips up some organizations or some people in organizations, because when we look at the branching out feature, you need to have this permission, basically. So you need to be in this security group. So those are the tenant level settings that are required or relevant to version control and deployment. So let's switch back over to our workspace. So I've created this workspace, it's completely empty. And what I want to do is connect it up to a Git repository. So the first things first is I need to actually create a repository. Okay, so I'm going to go to my Azure DevOps environment, and I've already created this. If you haven't got this set up in your organization, then the first thing you need to do is create an organization here. Then you're going to want to create a project here. Now I'm going to use this Fabric Dojo organization. We'll create a new project for this. Let's call it DP-700 dev. We'll make it private and then just create that there. All right, so I've got my Azure DevOps project set up here. There's lots and lots of different things that you can do in Azure DevOps. For this demo, we're just going to be focusing on the repos. We just want to connect our workspace to this repository. So I just need to initialize the repository, first things first. So down here, initialize main branch with a README. So I'm going to add a README. So now I have a main branch here. Okay, so it's got just a README on that main branch in my repository currently, which is good enough for this demonstration, good enough to get us started. So we've got an organization, we've got a project, and we've got a repo, and we've got a branch as well. Let's head over to Fabric and connect this workspace to that repository. So I've opened up my workspace settings. Obviously, you need to be a workspace admin to do that. And we're going to go to Git integration, this section here. You can obviously see there's two Git providers, Azure DevOps or GitHub. I'm going to choose Azure DevOps. I've already got my account set up, but the first time you do that, you're going to need to authenticate with your AAD or Microsoft Entra ID account. Okay, so that's going to bring you through to this UI here, connect Git repository and branch. So it's going to ask me for my organization, which is Fabric Dojo, my project, which is DP-700 dev, my repository, which was also DP-700 dev, and my branch, which is main. The Git folder is optional. Don't need to put anything there. If we leave this blank, it's just going to sync all of our items into the root of that branch. Connect and sync. All right, so then we get this source control pop up here. Now it's got 0 currently because there's no items either in the repository or in Fabric. So if we add a new item, let's just create a notebook, for example, and this is going to be loading to silver. So this is going to be in my notebook. We'll add code to follow. Make sure that's saved. We'll just close that. And now what you'll see, if we go back to our workspace settings, the source control button has got a big 1 in it. So it's detected that you've created a new item here and it's uncommitted. Okay, so there's a mismatch between what is in the Git repository and what's in your workspace. So very simple. What we can do is open up the source control UI over here, and it's going to show us the changes, which is this loading to silver. This status means that it's a new item, this green plus button. So what we can do is we can select that, add in a useful commit message, like initial commit of load to silver notebook, and we can just commit that. Now, some other features that we can have a look at whilst we're over here, if we want to click through to Azure DevOps, we can do that with this button here. The updates panel is going to show us any remote changes that have happened to the repository in Azure DevOps that we don't have in our workspace currently. The other thing to bear in mind is this other tab down here, and this is where we can go to either check out a new branch, so currently I'm on the main, or switch branch. Currently I've only got one branch in my repository, and obviously this functionality, or these two at least, is only available to admins. This branching out to a new workspace can be done by admins, contributors, and members, provided they have the ability to create new workspaces, as we saw in the admin portal. What I'm going to do is branch out to a new workspace just to show you that functionality. So we can add a new branch name, and normally this is done to create what's called feature branches. Okay, so if you are developing this load to silver notebook, and typically your dev environment might have some sort of branching policy in Azure DevOps. What this feature is, branching out to a new workspace, is basically going to copy absolutely everything that's currently in your repository on the current branch. It's going to copy it all over to a new workspace. It's going to allow you to develop new features or build changes to notebooks or data pipelines or whatever your feature that you're building is. And then what you can do is submit a pull request and then get those changes merged back into a protected main branch. Now, I'm not going to go through that whole process in this demo here because it's probably not required for DP-700, but just know that it is possible to do branching out to a new workspace. It does do absolutely every single item. So if you've got a load of different items in there, it can be a bit clunky, take a long time as well, and be a little bit error prone. Unfortunately, can't do it on an item by item level currently, but that feature is useful if you want to implement a feature branch strategy. Okay, that's pretty much everything I wanted to show you for version control. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this video, version control in itself, I could talk about for hours and go into lots of different strategies about how to apply this, talk about feature branches and elaborate branch policy setups, and also the API side of version control. But none of that is necessary for DP-700, so we'll keep it nice and tight today. Let's talk about deployment pipelines next. Next up, I want to talk about deployment pipelines. So deployment pipelines are a feature in Fabric that make it as simple as possible, really, to move items, essentially copy items, from different stages. So we normally have dev, test, and production. These can actually be, I think, between 2 and 10 different stages you can have, and you can call them whatever you like. So as I mentioned, obviously the most common is dev, test, and prod, or something like that. So we can connect these workspaces to a deployment pipeline. And then we can use the functionality of the deployment pipeline to essentially copy items from the dev workspace to the test workspace, with the goal that you can then test whatever you're working on, whether that's a notebook, you can give it a proper testing, unit testing, end-to-end testing, data quality testing, whatever your tests might be, that's where you do your testing. And then when you're happy with it, then you'll push it into the production workspace, again via that deployment pipeline. Now, the deployment pipeline is mostly a manual process, although there is an API for the deployment pipeline as well. So you can kind of have the best of both worlds, right? You can have some users that if they're not comfortable using the API, or you can set up automated routines that combine the deployment pipeline API. There's some PowerShell scripts that call that API, but from Azure DevOps as well. So just bear in mind that it can be both a manual process, but you can automate it using Azure DevOps, Azure Pipelines as well. And just a reminder here, if it doesn't get checked into version control, as I mentioned, it doesn't get deployed, okay? So refresh schedules, data, files, things like that don't get deployed. So there's a few other concepts to be aware of with this deployment pipeline feature. One of them is deployment rules. So to illustrate what a deployment rule is, it's essentially changing of various parameters between different deployment environments. So here we've got a simple deployment pipeline with a development and a test workspace, and we've got a direct lake semantic model and a lakehouse. Now these are connected, so the direct lake semantic model is reading from this lakehouse here. Now when we go to deploy this, by default, if we don't have any deployment rule configured, then the connection is going to still read from this lakehouse here. So the semantic model in your test workspace is going to read from your lakehouse here, which is not really what we want. What we want is, when we deploy it, we want these to be connected so that it reads then from the test lakehouse here. Now I do make it clear that this is a direct lake semantic model. With other forms of semantic model, something called auto binding exists. So this isn't really a problem, or you don't need it so much with those items. But to continue this direct lake semantic model example, what we can do is configure a deployment rule so that when we deploy this down here, this time, we can say, actually, I don't want you to read from the development workspace. I want you to now read from the test workspace, like so, which is what we want generally. Now, if you have a look at the documentation, this works for a few different item types. The coverage is not everything yet, let's say. Another concept to be aware of is item pairing for deployment pipelines. So any items that you deploy from one stage to the next have an under the hood connection to one another. This means that even if you change the names of the items between development and test, they're still going to be paired. Now, this is a property that we want. We want to maintain this property because it means that new changes that are deployed between the different stages, they're going to overwrite the item in the next stage. If you deploy a data pipeline on day one into test environment, then every subsequent time that you deploy that data pipeline, you want it to overwrite that version of the test environment, right? Items that are paired will have entries in two columns. And this is in the new deployment pipelines UI. So they have recently changed this. So I'm using the new deployment pipelines UI here. But essentially you have two columns here, source stage item and selected stage item. So if you have a value in both of these columns, it means that these items are paired and there's items in both the source stage and the selected stage. Okay, so here we are in a deployment pipeline. Now you can see all of your deployment pipelines and create new ones from here. So if you open up workspaces and then click on deployment pipelines here, I've already got one set up, this DP-700 pipeline. And what I needed for this was 3 workspaces, DP-700 dev, DP-700 test, and DP-700 prod. So 3 separate workspaces connected via this deployment pipeline. Now they've updated the UI. So I'm using the new deployment pipelines UI, which for me is not very intuitive, but I'll try and walk you through it as best possible. So the way that it works is you have to actually click on your target stage first. And from there, you can see it's kind of like working backwards, which I don't know, it's not how my brain works. So you have to select your target environment here, and then it's going to show you a deployment from development, okay? Then you get the status of compared to source. So is it different from source, only in source, that kind of thing. So this one that's only in source, you might want to select it and then deploy it to the target. So we can deploy this data pipeline into the target environment, which is this test workspace here. So one that we talked about in the slides is this button here, right? So it's this deployment rules. So this is where we set up deployment rules that will trigger when you push things from development to test. We can do it on the notebook. You can see here we changed the default lakehouse. So if I wanted, I can add a deployment rule. As mentioned, it's also not necessary for import mode semantic models. But if you've got direct lake semantic models, then you do still need to do deployment rules. So I did want to talk a little bit about the item pairing thing that I mentioned. So let's just open up DP-700 test, because that is where I just deployed that data pipeline to. So if I was to open up this data pipeline here and even change the name of it to load from ADLS 2, enter that. Okay, so now in my my test workspace, ADLS or load from ADLS 2 is the name of my data pipeline. If we go back to our deployment pipeline, even give it a refresh, it's not going to break that pairing. It's going to say different from source, but they're still on the same line, which indicates that they are still paired. So when I deploy again from development to test, it's going to overwrite. We're not going to have 2 copies of that data pipeline in there. It's just going to overwrite it like that, okay? Which is what we want. Okay, that's pretty much everything I wanted to show you for deployment pipelines. Let's move on to database projects. Okay, the last topic I want to talk about today is database projects. So database projects are a method that we can use to deploy changes to a Fabric data warehouse. Now, you can also use them for other items, but it's primarily currently used for the Fabric data warehouse. I think it's also available for the Fabric SQL database, but that is still a preview item at the time of recording, so it's unlikely you're going to get any questions about that in the DP-700. So let's just talk about what the process would look like if you wanted to do deployment via a SQL database project, and then I'll show you how to actually go and implement this in Fabric. So there's many different ways to get a SQL database project, and we mentioned in the version control section that automatically when we commit a data warehouse into version control, we get an instance of that database as a SQL project. Now that is probably the method that I would recommend because you're always going to have access to that repository. And if you clone that Azure DevOps repository locally, you're going to have it in a good place to connect to it from VS Code. So Visual Studio Code. We'll show you what this looks like in a minute. So then you're going to want to use a tool. I prefer VS Code for this. You can install a SQL database projects extension. Then what we're going to need to do is, well, because we've cloned the Azure DevOps repo locally, we can then connect to the database project, which is in that cloned repository via this VS Code SQL database projects extension. Then we can use Visual Studio Code as our IDE, as our code editor for making changes to the data warehouse. You might be adding a new table, adding a new view, doing some sort of structural change to the data warehouse. Then what we're going to do is perform a build step of that data warehouse from still within Visual Studio Code. What that's going to do is it's going to create an artifact called a DACPack file, and then we can use that to publish this DACPack. The DACPack is basically a representation of that data warehouse that we can then push back up into Fabric to deploy it via a SQL connection string. Actually, so that's what we're going to need to deploy changes back into Fabric. Now, the reason that this is a useful method in general is that because we have this artifact, that DACPack file, we can actually automate the production of that DACPack file, and we can automate the publishing of that DACPack file back into Fabric. So it can be used for an automated CI/CD process. Okay, so let's take a look at database projects in a little bit more detail. So to begin with, I'm just going to create a data warehouse and I'm going to populate it with some tables. So I'll just call this a SQL project demo. And I'm just going to populate it just with some tables to begin with. Okay, so now I've got a table and a schema, not the most exciting table, but it's good enough for this demo. So now what I'm going to do, we want to get the SQL project from this particular data warehouse, and I want to be able to open it in VS Code. That's where I'm going to be demoing the database project. Now, there's many different ways that you can get the database project. If you right-click on the actual database itself, you can download a SQL database project here. You can also click this button here. That's another way of doing it. There's lots of different ways. These are okay if you want to do like a one-off download and get your SQL project. But as I mentioned, I've created this warehouse in my Git-enabled workspace. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to commit this SQL project, this data warehouse, into version control. Because then what I'm going to do is I'm going to clone it to my local environment once that's up in Azure DevOps. So here we are now back in Azure DevOps, and you can see that is my SQL project demo. And this file here is the SQL project. So you can see we've got test, which is my schema, which I created, and then the tables underneath that, just one table with the SQL statement, the create table statement that was used to generate that table. So what we're going to do is we're going to clone this repository and we're going to open it up in VS Code. So I'm just going to click on clone here, and we've actually got this IDE shortcut to clone in Visual Studio Code, which is what I'm going to do. It's going to ask me for a location. I'll just put it in my documents, and I've got a folder here for Git, and I'll select that as my target location. Would you like to open the clone repository? Open. Okay, so now I have my cloud Azure DevOps repository cloned locally. So I can double check that. If I just right click here and do reveal in File Explorer, we can see this is actually in my local file explorer. All these files from Fabric via Azure DevOps have now been cloned, including my SQL project file. Okay, so what we're going to need to do is, if you haven't already, install the database projects, this one here, SQL database projects. So you need to install this extension. I've already done that. And what that's going to give you is this tab here for database projects. So when we've got this installed, I haven't actually had to do any sort of setup. It's already identified that I have one database project in the directory that I'm currently have open in Visual Studio Code. And this is basically what it looks like, right? It's got the same structure. It's got the test schema, then all of the tables that live underneath it. Any other references to any external tables, obviously I don't have any of that at the moment in this particular data warehouse. But this is what you can use then to develop your data warehouse going forward, right? I can add in another item, a second table, for example. Obviously I can't have primary key in there because you can't generate primary keys in a create table statement in Fabric. We need to do that via alter table. So I'll remove that and I'll just do ID. Maybe I'll add in a second column here. Very imaginative at naming. Okay, so we've got a second table, and let's say that these are the changes that I want to make to my data warehouse. So when I cloned it, there was only one table. Now there's two tables. So let's say I want to build this now and then publish it back into Fabric. So the way that you go about that, well, there's a few different ways, but you can either right click here, and I'm just showing you the manual way here first, just to kind of show you the process that it goes through. So when we click on build for this SQL project, you can see that what it's actually doing is it's going through and it's validating the model and it's creating this artifact, this DAC pack artifact here, basically, which is a representation of our database, including our new table. And this artifact can then be used in a deployment process. Okay. Now, we're not going to do the Azure pipeline side of things, but just know that is possible. You can do automated CI/CD using this process. What we're going to do is, now that we've got a DAC pack, we can now publish it back into Fabric. Now, to do this, you'll need to get the SQL connection string of your data warehouse. So if I go back into Fabric and I just grab my SQL connection string here, I'll copy that, publish to an existing SQL server, don't use profile. I'll just paste in my SQL connection string into the top there, create connection profile, server name, enter, database name was SQL project demo. We'll use the enter ID, this one needs to re-authenticate, select database, SQL project demo. And so either you can generate a script or just publish straight into Fabric. So I'm just going to publish straight into Fabric. And now you can see that it's deploying here the DAC pack in progress. So it's found that connection to the original data warehouse, and then it's basically deploying the changes that you've made into Fabric. All right, so now you can see that my deployment has successfully deployed this DAC pack file. Let's head back over to Fabric and see what it looks like. Okay, so here we are back in our SQL project demo in Fabric. And you can see if we go to DBO tables, there we go. So now we've got our second table in there. So we've deployed these changes via a SQL project back into Fabric. So you can develop kind of offline, locally, do all of your development there, do testing, and then deploy. Now, how this will probably work in practice is you would commit those changes, that SQL project, back into your Azure DevOps repository, and then you would trigger the build of the DAC pack and the deployment of that DAC pack automatically, which is one of the key benefits of the database project. Okay, thank you so much for watching. If you still want to join our DP-700 bootcamp, then I recommend you follow the link below and join Fabric Dojo. That's where we've got live sessions, study notes, lots and lots of discussions happening every single day. So look forward to seeing you there. If not, I'll see you in the next video in this series.